is a lot of people with NLD do tend to be empathetic. And I think some of that is just mental hardwiring. And I think some of it is if you have so many bad experiences and then you see somebody else in a bad place, you've been there. The bad things are common for you. So empathy, I guess, maybe doesn't come easier, but it's something that a lot of us learn to do very well.
Nonverbal learning disorder is characterized by difficulty with social skills, and often spatial and motor skills. It is often confused with and misdiagnosed as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, or autism. Edythe's guest this week is Geoff Hoppe, who will share what it's like to have NLD, as well as how others can better relate to people with NLD.
Hi folks, I'm your host Edythe Richards, and you may know me from my podcast series, Myers-Briggs Question Corner, or my website at topcareer.com. I've spent the last 20 years of my career helping people get smart about their careers. And I've found that lots of smart people aren't successful. Why is that? I'm convinced it's due to emotional intelligence. In EQ at Work, I'm bringing you inspiring people and messages to help you get smart about your emotions. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are hot topics today. When we think about diversity, it's easy to identify gender, race, ethnicity, or age, so-called visible differences. But diversity also includes differences that aren't immediately apparent. Thinking styles or personality styles, so socioeconomic levels, education, or even values or beliefs. And the same holds true for disabilities. Invisible disabilities are not immediately noticeable. They may include brain injuries, chronic pain, mental illness, gastrointestinal disorders, and many more. And because we may not notice them as easily or readily, they may be overlooked and misunderstood. And unfortunately, this can lead to discrimination or exclusion. Here with me today to talk on this topic is Geoff Hoppe, who's a content writer and editor in the Washington, D.C. area. We're here today to talk about one of these invisible disabilities called NLD. Geoff, welcome to EQ at Work.
Thanks, Edythe. Happy to be here.
Geoff, can you share with us what NLD is?
NLD stands for Nonverbal Learning Disability, or you see the D stand for disorder sometimes, same thing. The best pithy description I've seen of nonverbal learning disability is that it's the opposite of dyslexia, whereas a lot of people with dyslexia have trouble focusing on particulars, but they have a really great holistic, cosmic view of things. People with nonverbal learning disability are great at focusing on particulars, but we have trouble getting an overall holistic view of a situation. To use the old cliche, a lot of NLD'ers can't see the forest for the trees, but we will give you a phenomenally in-depth description of the one tree we're looking at. To, I guess, back up and give a more broad description, NLD is a developmental disability characterized by difficulties with visual spatial perception, organization, time management, short-term memory, making any kind of inferences, interpreting social interactions, and also we have trouble with nonverbal communication, hence the name. It's not that we don't talk. In fact, most NLD people I've met tend to be pretty talkative and we're good at expressing ourselves verbally. It's just that the nonverbal communication in any conversation is likely to escape us, or it could. So whereas I think a neurotypical person might read between the lines and interpret crossed arms or a raised eyebrow or a slight change in tone of voice as meaning something, I will not be sure of that. And a lot of NLD'ers I've talked to feel the same way and have the same problem.
So when I'm hearing you describe it, I can imagine that it's caused a lot of difficulties for you in terms of interacting with people. Would you be able to share about how it's affected you personally and professionally?
Absolutely. as far as difficulty communicating and interpreting reading signals and reading between the lines, that's been the story of my life. It is for many of the friends I have with NLD. Case in point, I was working a job once where a girl I was sort of an acquaintance with, I saw her as an acquaintance, kept sort of talking to me, and she'd spend a lot of time around me at the job, and she'd go out of her way to come say hello. And so then when at the end of our time working together, she offered her cell phone number and asked for mine, it just hit me like a ton of bricks. I had no idea it was coming. A normal person, I think a neurotypical person, would have realized, okay, these signals mean she's interested or not interested or something. So that's, a personal example of how not being able to pick up on nonverbal signals and cues can change the way you relate to other people. As far as professionally, it's been a huge challenge for me. It is for a lot of friends I know with NLD. I lost my job at my last full-time position because I really wasn't able to read the signals they were sending. I got into a particularly tough, rocky situation with the person who was head of HR at my company. And because things were not spelled out for me explicitly, because the people dealing the discipline were good at reading between the lines, I was unable to realize just how severe the situation was. And that blew up into a really big situation where I basically got backed into a corner and wound up quitting. So it can be something that really does either start or completely finish opportunities.
Yeah, there's so much just to process from those two very brief examples here. I guess my first question here would be, how do you, so if this is a disability with regards to processing nonverbal cues, so most of our language, most of our communication, most studies indicate it's over 70% that's nonverbal. How do you even begin to come to terms with that and learn that?
Oh gosh, a lot of
a loaded question, I know. Huh?
Yeah, it's been a ton of trial and error. I'm sad to say it's been a lot of sort of painful, awkward mishaps. Put bluntly, it's learning when not to speak and when to speak, because I will have trouble figuring out what the implications of my own statements are, and I'll have trouble figuring out from other people's statements are. A strategy that seems to work for me is get people to be very clear, ask a lot of questions. If you're thinking about something someone has said later and you think, oh, they may have meant X, do go back and ask them. Having NLD can be kind of exhausting in that regard. It does feel kind of like having a full-time job on top of whatever your profession is, because you're always picking over what has been said and trying to interpret it. I mean, it's not awful that way all the time, but it does take a good deal of legwork.
I mean, just hearing what you're talking about here, it sounds exhausting to me.
Honestly, there are times when I feel that way.
Yeah.
I started an NLD discussion group for people I met online with the disability this past year.
Oh, wow.
And it's been great. They're a great group of people, but the value of commiserating with them is absolutely wonderful, because it gives you other people who get what's going on and get where you're coming from, and who especially get that, yeah, it can be pretty exhausting. And there's a lot of legwork we're doing a good deal of the time that we're not going to talk about or describe or be verbal about, but it's going on in our head, and we're, attempting to do what we can to interact with a world that's pretty different.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, I'm so glad that you found this group of people, because I'm sure it just normalizes all of the experiences for you.
Oh, definitely. That, and it's also good for sharing strategies and sharing ideas, because we've bumped up against some of the same problems. And yeah, that means if one of us hasn't thought of something, somebody else may have. Because we struggle with short-term memory. Short-term memory is bad in folks with NLD generally. Mm-hmm. If one of us, 2 weeks ago, I thought up a hack for how to remember directions. Instead of just remembering directions in your head, like left on First Street, right on Third, hold up your left hand when you say left on First Street, and then hold up your right hand when you say right on Third. And if I do that a couple of times, for whatever reason, the kinesthetic learning makes it easier for me to remember it. I don't know why that is, but it's something that, we'll come up with hacks we can share like that to navigate literally and figuratively.
Yeah. What are some of the other strengths that you have that have helped you in overcoming these challenges?
Oh, gosh. As far as I'll admit, it is a work in progress for me.
Uh-huh.
And everyone I have so far met online and once in person with NLD would agree with that it is something that there's no solid playbook yet. To compare it again to something like dyslexia, NLD is not very well known. I think the understanding of NLD and the NLD community's position is, I would guess, like what the dyslexic community's position was maybe 50 to 60 years ago, where there's not a lot of knowledge of it. A lot of people have it and it hasn't been diagnosed. There aren't a lot of people with NLD as examples of success in life, and there's not a great deal of therapeutic, practical, helpful literature yet.
Is it almost like a case by case, like with now we're talking about on the spectrum of autism? Is it something akin to that where it's very individual in terms of how it manifests to the world?
Oh, heck yeah. It's kind of a fine balance because there's definitely times like with the discussion group I'm part of where one of us will mention something and we'll all say, oh yeah, and it'll all click for us. But the same phrase that I've heard applied to other disabilities absolutely applies to NLD, which is if you've met one person with NLD, you've met one person with NLD.
I see.
There can be a big difference, not just in how it affects you personally, but in what sort of information you process and how quickly you process and in how you handle basic life skills. Just one, for instance, one of the few books about NLD by someone with NLD is by a guy whose day job is a statistical consultant. He works with stats. And to me, that's just mind-blowing because I'm terrible with math. I'm terrible with numbers. I have a lot of friends with NLD who are similarly, yet this guy, his name is Peter Flom, Flom is the last name. His book is really good. I'd suggest anybody with NLD looking it up. And yet here's Peter Flom, who works with numbers quite ably for a living. So there can be a great deal of variance, yes.
Yeah, and personality-wise too, just in terms of personal strengths that you're using to come to terms with this, overcome it. So I think your experience is in many ways, I love that analogy that you said. If you met one person with NLD, you met one person with NLD, that really puts it into perspective. You were diagnosed with this fairly recently, is that right?
I was diagnosed when I was 34, I guess it was, and I'm 37 now. So, and that's actually pretty common as I understand as well. A lot of NLD'ers are initially diagnosed with ADHD or ADD like I was when I was 9 years old. And they can go a long time thinking that's what they have and not realizing, that the real diagnosis is NLD. It seems like that happens to a fair deal of people, though from talking to folks online, I think the good news is that more and more people are getting the NLD diagnosis when they're younger, when they can really start structuring their life and getting through adolescence in a way that may keep them from making the same sort of mistakes NLD can dispose you to make. I liken it to the difference between being adrift at sea without a life raft and with a life raft, with the diagnosis as the life raft. You are still very much adrift at sea, but there is a world of difference between treading water and having like a stable life raft where even though there's storms and there's big waves and there's sharks, you are operating with that life raft from a position of knowledge and strength and stability that you did not have before. And maybe it's balsa wood, maybe it breaks, but it's still something. Likewise, there's days when I get really mad and think there are so many challenges about NLD that feel insurmountable, but it is so much better to have the diagnosis, to be able to orient my attempts to interact with the world based around the categories and the criteria of the diagnosis, to be able to say, oh, well, this is an NLD problem because I talked to my friend Chris, who has NLD and he's had the same issue. Or like a friend of mine, Matt, on my discussion group, who, because of confusion and things not being made clear for him and impulse control issues, he also lost a job 2 months ago. And it's great for me to be able to say, that sounds exactly like what I went through 2 years ago at Gartner. You know, how much in my angrier moments I'll think, oh boy, what good does a diagnosis do me? But that's just frustration talking. The reality is that it's your ability to stand on your own 2 feet. It's kind of, I guess, like once you finally get a job, if you've ever been jobless, like I and a lot of NLD'ers go for often pretty long times without work, because a good deal of getting hired revolves around inferring things about looking good, about social cues. It's all things that we can't do. So a lot of us will go long spells without a job. And even if you get a job you don't care for, there is still a great feeling of independence and self-sufficiency in the sense that, okay, I can actually pay my bills. I may not like working at, say, Barnes & Noble, but I'm at least getting regular paychecks. I'm no longer dependent on outside help. This is a springboard I can use to go somewhere else and do other things. And that to me is very much what a diagnosis does for you. It is not the end. You still got to work the sail and you got to paddle that raft, but you are at least not dangling your legs out to be chomped on by a shark.
I'm curious about what it's like for you when you meet another person, for example, for the first time. What happens with you in terms of, I mean, especially with the nonverbal communication?
The weird thing is, I'm not even sure what signals I'm giving off when I first meet somebody.
Oh.
I've had very close friends in the past who said the first time we hung out, it seemed like you were really anxious and you didn't enjoy being there and you wanted to get away. And I'd say, holy cow, I had no idea I was giving off those signals. That's not how I felt. I really enjoyed just getting to, sit and talk with you for a bit. So in terms of first meeting people, it's troublesome for me to know what signals I'm sending off. It's troublesome for me to read the signals other people give. I try to deal with it just by being polite, as forward as I can, while still being my introverted self.
Yeah, just you've got to be yourself. So, I mean, I can see back to what you said about how exhausting this must be if you're constantly questioning the signals that you're giving off or just replaying that in your mind. Oh, I should have said this. I should have done this. Yeah, that must really mess with your head, huh?
It's very much like having an overactive internal monologue. I don't know if you recall that show Scrubs that was on like in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
I feel kind of like JD, the main character in that, where he has a really active internal monologue and it thinks up these really weird things and it just pops right into his way of thinking when he's talking to people. But yeah, there is a lot of that. And I'll also say NLD can be a big source of anxiety, especially when meeting new people. And anxiety is a pretty common comorbidity with NLD. A lot of us do wind up, or the people I've talked to at least, benefit from therapy, particularly old talking cure. They'll just sit on the couch and talk things out. Because it can be pretty stressful just getting through the day. I am not somebody who has ever looked forward to mixers or meeting new people. And when people say, oh, finding a new job is easy, you just have to network, I want to be like, okay, that's chilling like a turtle to just hop out of his shell.
Yeah.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to circle back a minute to a question I meant to ask earlier, which was really about how you're harnessing your own strengths in managing this disorder.
Focus is definitely one of them. Like we were talking about earlier, how dyslexia has trouble focusing on particulars, but NLD people can at times get a real hyper-focus on particulars. That can be a strength because it means I can really zoom in on something that interests me or that is important to me and learn a great deal about it. If you want an expert on a topic and you have a friend with NLD who knows something about it, they can be your walking encyclopedia. They will know a great deal, and there's a good chance they'll be able to know some of the little ins and outs too. I'd venture to guess that a lot of neurotypical people just sort of overlook. We like going in depth. We like reading anything and everything about a topic that interests us. That's a generalization, but thus far, I've found it to be the case.
Yeah.
With at least the discussion group. And that's people I've known, I guess we talk 2 or 3 times a month. I think you would find a lot of NLD people who, when there's something they're interested in, they can hyperfocus and know a lot about it and probably find the little ins and outs normal people either are not interested in or just don't realize the importance of. I guess another way to deal with all of this is learn how to take a punch, metaphorically. Although, it's good literally too, I suppose, life skill. I would not recommend practicing this on your own. Yeah, it's good to, without meaning to sugarcoat it, there are a fair deal of misunderstandings and frustrations, and you just kind of learn by necessity, I guess, to get hit and keep on moving. I always love characters in fiction like that who they just don't stop. One of my personal hero, one of them is Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general. And he's somebody who I feel was also probably neurodiverse, but I like that notion of like that, or if you're familiar with the story of the 300 Spartans at the Pass of Thermopylae, people who can just stick with one thing and the perseverance is just remarkable. They don't stop. You throw an army at them and they're going to keep coming at you. That is a necessary survival skill for any sort of neurodiversity. I don't have all kinds of neurodiverse diagnoses, but I have a brother with Down syndrome. And I can tell you from, growing up with Greg, the world was not designed for people with NLD or Down syndrome. Fortunately, I think the world is getting more understanding, thank goodness. But when you live in a world that is designed for people other than you just have to keep on coming. You basically have to learn to take the calluses and the bruises and just run, go.
Yeah, it takes, a willingness, I think, for you to challenge your own thinking and challenge the way you naturally are. But in that, you're finding that perseverance. And it sounds like what you're using to overcome a lot of the challenges that you have. And that actually brings me to the next point that I want to make, because obviously this is a podcast about emotional intelligence. And just hearing you talk about this, I think emotional intelligence must take on a completely different meaning for you than it does for other folks.
I definitely think so. I find emotional intelligence to be a very difficult thing to get because it seems like a lot of the parts of emotional intelligence, I think you said there were 8 parts of it.
Well, the model I tend to use, there's 16 different elements of emotional intelligence. Okay. Many people, they tend to think of interpersonal relationships, being a good communicator, being empathetic, those areas as what emotional intelligence is. But it also includes things like problem solving and impulse control and managing stress.
Now that you mention it, yeah, absolutely. It's like you're reading off a list of things that are tough for people with NLD. Yeah. But one positive thing I'll say about NLD is a lot of people with NLD do tend to be empathetic. And I think some of that is just mental hardwiring. And I think some of it is if you have so many bad experiences and then you see somebody else in a bad place, you've been there. The bad things are common for you. So empathy, I guess, maybe doesn't come easier, but it's something that a lot of us learn to do very well. But a lot of those other things you mentioned, like impulse control, that's very tough for me. Communicating, of course, I don't know what I need to communicate sometimes, and I'm not sure what other people are suggesting unless they're very explicit. Those things are all for whatever it is that causes NLD. And the verdict is out, though there are theories and ideas. Those things are all tough. I guess to use an analogy, it's not that those things are impossible for someone with nonverbal learning disability, but emotional intelligence is to somebody with NLD as, say, wrestling or gymnastics is to somebody with a very weak core muscles, naturally. It is possible to do those sports if you were just born with really weak abs and core muscles, but it's going to be tougher for you and you're going to need to put in more work. Or imagine like EQ is to NLD, I would argue, as ice hockey or figure skating is to somebody with weak ankles and, weak legs. You can figure skate and play ice hockey if you have naturally weak ankles and weaker legs, but you're going to have to put in more time at the gym. You're going to have to watch things. You're going to be putting in extra time when everybody goes home, just doing calf up and downs to make sure the ankles are strong. Yeah. So.
And yet, even as you kind of described some of your strengths, focus and perseverance, Just like with, I think, anybody else, there's some elements of emotional intelligence that just come easily to some people more than other people. And there's other ones that we constantly have to work on. And, with empathy, like I hear what you're saying here. I am a naturally empathetic person. And sometimes I forget that, hey, not everybody naturally has that muscle to be empathetic, and they do have to learn it, kind of like what you were saying.
If you're dealing with somebody with NLD who has trouble with those facets of emotional intelligence, I'd absolutely argue patience, empathy, sympathy, because from what I've read, at least, NLD is something that does seem to be caused just by like one particular physical part of our brains being differently designed. Like one of the descriptions of NLD or explanations is that we have smaller spleniums or like weaker spleniums. There's certain neural networks in our brain where, because the physical parts of the brain are weaker, those neural networks don't work very well. So it's possible, but again, it's something where the person with NLD is not just dealing with a psychological something, but something hardwired and neurological as well. It's not just a software problem, but a hardware challenge.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying here. Just everything that you're doing is going to take 2 or 3 times as long probably as for somebody else.
I think so. Certain things, yes. Although there's also times where I don't know what it is about NLD, but there's times when people with NLD will just immediately get something that neurotypicals don't. There are these weird moments of intuition and insight. I think because we're so good at hyper-focusing on details, that might take a long time for someone neurotypical to arrive at, but we'll just look at something and we've got to figure it out. And I'm not sure what is behind that. I just know that I've heard it's the same for other NLD'ers, and that there have been plenty of cases where I've had friends or family members say, how on earth did you figure that out? How did you know that? Just snap. That, and to mention one other sort of strength, long-term memory seems to be a strength for NLD folks.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we seem to have short-term memory as a struggle, but we seem to have really good long-term memory. So to kind of jump professional for a minute, we would be good sources of institutional knowledge, I guess that's the term. Yeah. I should remember the term I've written about. Is it institutional knowledge, institutional wisdom? What's the term for that?
Yeah, institutional knowledge.
Yeah, we're great for that. The trick is finding a job where you can stick around long enough and build that up.
Exactly. That's just what I was thinking. So it's sort of like you have a database in your mind, and you can just call on pieces of information as needed in the moment.
Not to brag, but...
But go ahead anyway. We want you to brag, Geoff.
Now, this is for the sake of other folks with NLD as well, then, who have the same thing. We're your ringer on the trivia team. Because We're going to know a lot of random things. And that's sort of a fun parlor game thing. But again, what it can translate to in terms of interpersonal relationships and success in the workplace is we have a good sort of long view of the situation. If you've got a good long-term memory, you don't just look at what the newest development is. You don't just think, what are the 5 things you need to know for 2021? You see things in a broader timeline. And that can be very useful. You'll know, like, we're the sort of people who will not just talk about what's going to be new with the internet this year. We're going to say, oh, well, that's different from the way it was in the late 90s. We remember when and how the internet got big. We remember that it was originally just a defense communications network.
Your mental database here, that's what I'm going to call it. And it's almost like you can compare present and past, and you're going to be able to see those details a little more easily and readily than an average person, or neurotypical, as you called them, might.
I think that's one way of putting it. I don't know if every NLD person is as much of a history buff as I am, but they do think. This is, I guess, an example. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because what I'm saying and what you're saying about the database, it's a good example of how somebody with an NLD, on one hand, can seem totally out of water, but they can have a lot going on upstairs. And they can have a tremendous amount of knowledge about certain topics, and even stuff they're not as interested in. Now that I think about it, it's a struggle for me to focus on things that bore me. But every now and then, even things that bore me, I'll still remember occasionally more than people who like those topics or know them.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, and why this is the case, I'm not sure. Part of the problem is there is so little research done about NLD that it's like your guess is as good as mine. And even within what research has been done, most of the research is done on kids. If you're an adult with NLD, you're a bit SOL because it's like most of, and I'm glad the next generation of NLD'ers has research being done about them. But I do wish there were some professor or some expert, because I've reached out to a great deal of them or tried to, who wanted to put an adult in the MRI machine. To this point, all the studies I've read or seen, they tend to be, we took kids who were 10 or 11 and put them in an MRI machine and saw what parts of the brain did and didn't light up. I am desperately hoping at some point someone does that with adults, though in the meantime, if you have NLD or you know somebody with NLD, your best strategy is to find other people, find online support groups, find people you can talk to, because at the moment it's sort of, we have each other. Not a lot of outside help is coming.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that was actually going to be one of my next questions here. If someone does suspect that they have this or they know someone who has it, do you have any other suggestions for folks other than seeking out online support, suggestions for other people who suspect they might have it or know someone who does?
Oh gosh, the discussion group I've got, we're sort of starting to expand. I definitely recommend looking up the NVLD or NLD Project podcast and websites. That's the thing. I forgot that actually there's another acronym for NLD. It's called either NLD or NVLD for Nonverbal Learning Disability. But NVLD.org is the premier group for scholars and NLD'ers who study this and write about it and are trying to get NLD included in the next round of the DSM, which is the great big phone book of psychological disorders, disabilities, diagnoses.
Yeah.
One of the side problems about NLD is that it is not yet in the DSM, so it's not recognized by insurance companies. So that's an extra trouble. But I'd recommend look up the NVLD project. If you suspect it's what you have, the full battery of tests is, warning, very expensive. If you have the money, though, it is worth every cent, because it's the difference between thinking your problem is one thing that it's not, and then finding out, holy cow, I'm part of something bigger, and I need other strategies and solutions. But the full testing I did, it was, we did the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. We did a bunch of others. It was, I think, 2 or 3 sessions of like 3 hours apiece with a professional psychologist. So it is a lot to go through, but it is the best money I've ever spent. I guess that's the best advice I have for if you think you have it or if you think someone else has it and you're not exactly sure. NVLD Project will have good information. It'll have links to other people. And they've got a couple of great little explainer YouTube videos linked up that give you just sort of the basics of what it is and whether you have it.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank
Sure
you.
thing.
One other question I have with regards to this is for people, as you described them, neurotypical people who may live with or work with or just know people who have NLD. Do you have any suggestions for us?
Oh, goodness. I guess just to be patient like you would be with anyone else. If something seems strange or off about the way somebody is communicating or asking questions, don't act like it's really weird. Certainly don't ostracize somebody. If you think you're dealing with somebody who has NLD or you do, I've had supervisors who are great because they would come right out and say, here's what I want you to know about this. Here's what I'm thinking. Don't worry, I don't mean X. I do mean Y. At my last full-time job, I had an absolutely terrific manager. And she was terrific because she would always say, if I want to talk to you in private, she'd say, don't worry, it's not trouble. It's that I want to talk about X, Y, Z. Here's what I'm thinking. What do you think? She was straightforward about it. She was very explicit. Those sorts of things can really help someone with NLD.
So it's really like relying on being very explicit verbally with what you're saying, and don't assume that facial expressions, body language, the nonverbal signals are going to be understood by the other person, right?
Bingo. At least for me. It has to be spelled out and then it has to be repeated. Even when something is spelled out, I usually do need a bit of repetition, and there's that poor short-term memory coming in. But also, it needs to be made clear in a way that will seem overbearing or insulting to somebody neurotypical. But for me, it's not overbearing or insulting. It's just, okay, now I get what's going on. Now I know what you maybe want out of this down the road. Now I know where it's coming from. It's almost kind of like I want more context and I want you to be more explicit, because that memory I have, that great long-term memory, doesn't see things in terms of short-term views. It sees things in terms of everything I know, and it wants to know what's going to go on. And yeah, so explicit always helps. If you can tell us what you think the long game behind your idea is, that's going to help too.
Awesome. Very helpful information. Thank you so much, Geoff. Where can listeners get in touch with you?
Oh gosh, my LinkedIn is probably the best idea. Geoff is spelled funny. It's Geoff, and Hoppe, Hoppe. And believe it or not, there is another one like me who looks vaguely like me.
Okay.
He's in Colorado. That's not me. He is a channeler for the Count de Saint Germain, a strange 18th century possible vampire. Don't ask me how I know that. But yeah, the only other guy with my name is a channeler for an 18th century possibly undead count. That's luck for you.
Well, glad we know that. Yeah. But yeah, I will put your LinkedIn profile there in the listening notes for listeners. Really appreciate you being willing to come and talk about this topic. You know, I put you on the spot there quite a bit and really appreciate your openness with this. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity. Yeah, no trouble. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. And one last thing I will mention, if you're looking for info about NLD, look up Chris Rock, the comedian of all people. This past summer, he was diagnosed with NLD.
Wow.
Everybody just cheered wildly in the NLD community because it's like, finally, we have a celebrity. You know, dyslexia has Orlando Bloom and Richard Branson and Cher and Keira Knightley. And for ages, we kept saying, for God's sakes, give us a celebrity. And finally, we got somebody who's pretty well known. So if you want to look at it, that's also, there are a couple of interviews with him from, I want to say like August 2020 that are intriguing because he talks about it briefly, but the things he says are all, you know, pretty darn accurate and pretty resonant for those of us with NLD. Hopefully more and more people are going to get diagnosed, and we will have our own sort of constellation of stars to help orient those of us who need diagnoses.
Well, I hope so. Fingers crossed then for you.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Geoff, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks again. Wishing you all the best in this new year that's upon us.
Thank you, Edythe. Likewise. And yeah, thanks for doing what you do. Keep it up.
In talking with Geoff, it was clear to me that he's a different person than he was before his diagnosis with NLD. Before the diagnosis, he'd been wrongly diagnosed with ADHD, and he knew something was off, but he couldn't pinpoint it. Geoff spent years struggling with disappointments due to interpersonal challenges, job loss, self-esteem issues, and much more. Having an accurate diagnosis offered a new perspective, and it shows just how important awareness is. Self-awareness is a foundational element of emotional intelligence, and without it, we flounder. We can't account for our feelings. We may bottle up our emotions and feel hurt by others as a result. We may even keep that part of ourselves hidden and hold on to it until it turns to anger and hatred and poor impulse control. If we're not aware of this anger or hatred, it's much easier to lash out and explode. And that's when we lose friendships or jobs or worse. The emotional intelligence element of self-awareness is understanding our own strengths, our blind spots, our communication styles, and everything else that makes us tick. Without adequate self-awareness, we're unable to improve ourselves or our surroundings. The more we know about ourselves, the better equipped we'll be to adapt to situations and challenges that life throws at us. If this is something you struggle with, learning to reflect on your thoughts and emotions is key. I want to share with you the most effective tip I've found to boosting self-awareness, and that is to observe and learn. Several times throughout the day, pause and check in with yourself. Ask yourself, what emotion am I feeling right now? Give that emotion a name. Is it anger? Is it frustration, disgust, or is it irritability? Then note the cause of the emotion. Why are you feeling this way? What led up to this emotion? And then note what this emotion looks and sounds like to other people. What effect does it have on others? And finally, what can you do to either stop feeling this way or continue feeling this way? Most of us actually run on autopilot most of the day, and it may feel strange at first to check in with yourself like this, but the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, and the more you'll notice which thoughts are helpful and which aren't. And that's the first step toward positive change.
Thanks for listening to EQ at Work. Find us using the hashtag EQ at Work, or visit our website eqatwork.net. Subscribe to this podcast via iTunes, Spreaker, or your favourite podcast platform. We'd love you to leave a rating or review, and if you have a moment, a simple share would be wonderful. Remember, tell your friends, mastering your emotions matters. What do immigrants really think about Americans? Tune in to next week's episode, which features the personal, uplifting story of an immigrant from China in This American Dream.